There's an interesting negative commandment in the Torah, and it's predicated on a relationship with God. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people, "Bonim atem l'Hashem Elokechem." You are God's children. You are God's children. Lo siskodedu. Lo sasimu korcha b'neinechem lames. You know, in the ancient cultures, if somebody would die and people would express their grief, they would take shards of pottery and they would begin lacerating their bodies because they couldn't contain the pain, the loss of the loved one who they had lost. Losses go to do. If you do that, if you lacerate yourself to express your grief for a loved one who died or for anyone who died, you're in violation of a negative commandment. Also, people, they would be beside themselves, they would start pulling the hair out of their heads. So if you do the expression of grief, it manifests itself either by laceration or by pulling one's hair out of one's head. One is in violation of these two negative commandments. Now the question is why? What's the reason? So there's a very fundamental Sefarno who explains, bottom losses go to do. You're not permitted to lacerate yourself. You're not permitted to express your grief, uncontainable pain, and you begin pulling the hair out of your head. It's predicated on bonam atem l'Hashem Elokechem. When a person dies, as special as that person may be, the one who's left behind, why does he grieve? There are one or two reasons why he grieves. Either because he's concerned for the person who died. That's one reason. Where is he now? You're not able to take care of him, to provide for him, or to have a relationship with him, but it's for the sake of the one who died. Well, no, it's the one who died. That's not the issue. It's because we're left bereft. We're left abandoned. We no longer have that relationship. So the person who's left behind, he's grieving for himself. He's not grieving for the deceased, but he's grieving for himself because he's now all alone, abandoned. And even though you may have a support system, but it's still not the same because that person was integral to your life. Those are the two reasons why a person would grieve and would reach a level of sorrow and pain that he can't contain himself. And that's why he starts lacerating his body and pulling the hair out of his head for those two, one of those two reasons. Let's read a little further. Firstly, Moshe says you are Hashem's children. You're God's children. Ki am kodosh ato l'Hashem Elokecho. You're God's holy people. U'b'chobocha Hashem lios l'olam segulo. And he chose you to be the nation which is the equivalent of a treasure. From all the nations of the world, Ashel Pnei Adama, which are on the face of the earth. So it says two things here. Firstly, you're God's children. Secondly, you're Am Kodesh L'Hashem Elokecha. You're God's holy people. And he chose you to be his treasure from all the nations of the world. A human being is a composite of the physical and the spiritual. What is death? Death is only of the physical. When the soul departs from the body is no longer alive. The person's no longer alive. Jewish belief is the soul lives on eternally. There's a question exactly what happens to the soul. If the soul is worthy, the soul goes eventually to a location called the soul world. To be able to bask in the radiance of God, to have that relationship with God, which there's nothing comparable to that pleasure, although the word pleasure we only relate to within the physical sense, to that level of goodness, but that's only a holding pattern. Ultimately, when God is ready to resurrect the dead, he will reunite that soul with the body to be one entity, to be fully spiritualized, to be able to bask and have that relation with God. And that's what we call the world to come. That's the ultimate eternal world, which God will create a new world, and the soul rejoined with this new body, which was resurrected to live eternally, to bask in God's presence for all eternity. So let's talk. We said a person grieves for one of two reasons. The person's concerned for the person who died. You're a holy people. God chose you to be his treasure. One does not be concerned about the person who dies. The person who dies is a better place than anybody could imagine. So to grieve and be pained for the person who's no longer here, that person you don't have to be concerned for. That person is the better place. However, what about ourselves? We've been abandoned. We need that financial support. We need emotional support. We need that counsel. We need that protection. We need whatever that person represented and what the person's representation was in our lives. We're bereft. We feel all alone. We're abandoned. If we are God's children, who is he to us? He's our Father. You cannot compare a mortal father to God, who's our Father at every level. He's our provider. Every nuance of our need, he provides with mercy, with kindness at a level which is unfathomable. So if a person's able to lock into one of these, both of these concepts and realities, we are God's children. What are you concerned? But he was my ticket to success. You know, the Talmud tells us, everything's predestined except one's free choice. One's choice. The Talmud tells us that one's yearly financial stipend is decided from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. Whether you succeed or fail has nothing to do with who you know or what you know, but rather it's what God determines what you're going to have for the year. What opportunities and what are not opportunities. The pitfalls of life, are you going to be aware of them or you're not going to be aware of them? All that's determined by God. It has nothing to do with who you know or who you don't know. So if you believe and you're able to internalize the reality that we are God's children and he is our Father, there's no father who could care for us as well as God himself. Surpasses anything that the mortal father can do. So first you have to understand, you're God's children. So if that's the reason, if the reason why you're grieving and you feel bereft is because you feel abandoned and all alone, there's no reason to lacerate your body because you can't contain the pain or to pull the hair out of your head. And if you do, what is that an indication of? It's a lack of your belief in who God is in terms of what his relation with you is, what that relationship is. Therefore, if you do lacerate yourself because you can't contain the pain and you pull your hair out of your head as an expression of that grief, you violate a negative commandment because that's a breach of your faith and belief in God, of who God is to you. Who is your provider? But maybe we should be concerned for the person we loved. He's no longer here. We can't take care of him. We can't assist him. We can't support him. You don't have to worry about that person. Ki am kodesh l'Hashem Elokecha. We are a holy people to God. That means after we leave this world, we go to a better place. We go to the world to come. We have a relationship. We bask in God's glory, which is the good on the absolute level. So every reason why you should be pained and experience an uncontainable emotional meltdown should not be. And if you are experiencing that, it's a reflection of where you stand in terms of your beliefs, in terms of your relation with God and what you believe in the world to come. That's why you're in violation of this negative commandment. There's a negative commandment in the Torah. A Jew is not permitted to take revenge. A person is not permitted to harbor ill feeling against another person because the person denied him something that he wanted. And it's depicted in these two contexts. A person goes to his fellow and says, I'd like to borrow your axe. And he says, I'm sorry, I'm not lending you my axe. Next day, the person comes to him, he says, I'd like to borrow your spade, your shovel. He says, I will not lend you my shovel because when I asked you for the axe, you didn't give it to me. I will not lend you my shovel. That's revenge. That's a manifestation of what? Of not giving because something that happened in the past, that's taking revenge. What's harboring ill feeling? The person comes to you and says, I'd like to borrow your axe, turns you down, says no. Next day or some time later, the other person says, I'd like to borrow your shovel, your spade. He says, something? Although you didn't lend me your axe, I'm a better person than you are. I will lend you the shovel that you're asking for. You're in violation of harboring ill feeling. Because factually speaking, there was no reason to say what you said. That you had to express it means that negative feeling towards that person is still resonating within you, that the reason why he turned you down, he did something negative. He denied you something which he should have done. That's what you felt. So therefore, although you're a better person than he is, because you're going to, despite that, do differently than he did, but expressing it indicates that you're attributing the reason why he was turned down and denied was due to be withholding, and you're harboring that ill feeling. You have no right to harbor that ill feeling. It's a negative commandment. So the chinuch, who's a codifier, one of the earlier codifiers, he writes, why? If a person doesn't want to do you a favor, why can't you go say tit for tat, measure for measure? You don't lend me, I don't lend you. What's so wrong? So the chinuch explains regarding the negative commandment of losikon, you're not permitted to take revenge. Now, a person is walking down the street and he trips and he breaks his leg. Why did he break his leg? Because he didn't notice a crack in the sidewalk and he tripped and breaks his leg. Who is he going to blame? You blame one of two. Either himself, I was careless, I should have been more responsible. You can't blame the sidewalk. Or you trip over the root of a tree and you lacerate your head because you fall on, you hit your head in the tree. Who are you going to blame? You can only blame yourself. But you realize nothing happens unless it's been decided by God it should happen. You only incurred that injury because God wanted you to incur that injury. That's why it happened. So when you trip on the crack in the sidewalk, or you trip over root of a tree, whatever the degree of that injury and pain is, it's exactly that because God wanted you to experience that. That's why it happened. When a third party, you're in need of a loan, otherwise they're going to dispossess you from your house if you don't pay the loan to the bank. And somebody could give you that money and the person withheld. You blame that person, the reason why you were dispossessed and the reason why you suffered all the trauma and all the inconvenience was because this man withheld the money from you. That's not the reason. If God wanted you to have that money, he would have sent you to another lender who would have been more than happy to lend you the money. Why did you go to this man? You know why? Because God didn't want you to have the money. God wanted you to be dispossessed, to suffer whatever embarrassment, trauma you had. It's unrelated to that person. That person was only God's agent to carry out God's will, although that was not his intention. So that he turned you down was unrelated to you experiencing the pain, the embarrassment, and the disappointment. It's really rooted in God himself. So when you take revenge on that person, it's a denial of the reality of why you experienced what you experienced, why you incurred that injury. It's unrelated to that person. That person was only the agent, as he says, he was the rod of God that you should be injured. That's all he was. Is he culpable for causing the injury? Yes. The damager is culpable, but that's not why you were damaged, and that's not why you were hurt. You were hurt only because God wanted you to be victimized. That's why you were victimized. And that's the understanding. The Talmud tells us in one location, Ein Odom Nokef Etzvo Lemato, which I will explain what that means. Ella in Kemachrizin Lo Milmalo. A person does not stub his finger or his toe on the terrestrial level unless at that moment there was a pronouncement from heaven that you stub your finger. So you stub your toe, you see stars. The pain is excruciating. What do? You berate yourself. How careless was it? If I would have been more careful, it wouldn't have happened. But that it did happen, because at that moment, and why you were not cognizant, and you did something which allowed you to experience that level of pain, because at that moment, they pronounced from heaven, you should experience that level of pain. It's not just happenstance. It's not happenstance. There was a pronouncement from heaven. Therefore, if at the moment you experience that, you think in your mind that this pain is part of an atonement process, and you somehow associate with that, you're maximizing on that painful experience. And if you do tshuva, we all know we're not perfect. King Solomon says in Koheles, there's no perfect tzaddik who's perfectly good. We all have our skeletons in our closets, whether it's deliberate, inadvertent, whatever it is. We need atonement. Therefore, so if you have in mind the reason why to have, rather than berating yourself and say, how foolish was I, rather you say, it's a message. God is sending a message. God is collecting debt. That's what this is about. It's the same idea. You're not permitted to take revenge, because the person who victimized you, he couldn't victimize you unless you were meant to be victimized, unless it was determined by God you should be victimized. If it would have been A, it would have been B, C, D. There are many victimizers out there. If he didn't want you to be victimized, you would have never met up with the person who did victimize you. Therefore, you have no right to take revenge against that person, because that itself is a breach of your belief in what the reality of the system is, how the system works. You're God's children. You're not permitted to lacerate yourself, to take a shard of pottery and start just tearing your flesh or pulling the hair, because you're living in uncontainable pain. Because why are you grieving? Is it because you feel abandoned? That's why you're bereft. You feel helpless. Your father, who's here, surpasses whatever your mortal father was. And he will provide if it's meant, you should be meant to be provided with. That's what it's about. Is it because you're concerned for the deceased? Where is he? You're a holy people, therefore your souls are attuned and structured that they could cleave to God. So the person who dies in a better place than he was previously. This world is only the proving grounds. Once you leave this world, now you're ready to take advantage of what you earned in this lifetime. This is how the Sepharno explains the puzzle. We speak about a person who's orphaned. An orphan loses a parent at a young age. So the Torah says, who's the father of orphans? God is Avi HaYisolim. God is the father of orphans. Meaning God, the level of mercy that God has for an orphan is different than his mercy for anyone else. As a result of that, if a person abuses an orphan or causes undue pain for an orphan, God's reaction is much more severe than if you cause pain to an ordinary Jew. Because it's like, it's God's only child. How do you have the audacity to go and cause undue pain, undeserving pain to God's child. We're all God's children, but the orphan takes on a special value because he doesn't have that human father, the mortal father, to protect him and to give him that support, whatever that support is. Talmud tells us at one location, Shlosha Shutfim B'Adam, there are three partners in every human being: the father, the mother, and God himself. What is God's contribution? God contributes the soul. The mother and father, they contribute to physicality, different aspects of the physicality of the human being. So the father provides the physical. He is the breadwinner. He is the anchor. He's the emotional, mental support. He gives the person that sense of confidence. Rabbeinu Bachya writes in one location that when a child is first born, the child is born an unintelligible human being. But the child knows that what is the source of the child's security and sustenance? The breast of his mother. That's all the child knows, nothing more than that. So what does the child gravitate to naturally and attach itself to? The mother. As the child develops and realizes that there's another figure in his life, the father figure versus the mother figure, the child looks up to his father. The child gives him that confidence, gives him that sense of value, because the father is the breadwinner. He's the one who makes many decisions, which the mother does not. She acquiesces to the father's position. So what does the child do now? Looks up to the father. The child realizes now, being more intelligent, the mother, she provided the milk. She provided the warmth. But who's the protector of the family? The father. Even the mother needs the father to give her that level of protection. So the child now looks to the father. As the child gets older, the child becomes a little cocky. I understand it's my father, I understand it's my mother, but there are people out there that are a lot brighter and more successful and more capable than my father. Maybe I have to go fend for myself. I have to look for my own opportunities. Now, this is the real challenge now. Now that you're very developed in adolescence and you have adult intelligence, and now that you've become an adult, you have liability. Now you have choices to make. Who is the basis? Where is your confidence? Where is your security? Where's it all rooted in? Now we have to talk about, do you believe in God? Don't you believe in God? And what is God? How does God play into your life? What does he contribute? And there are many challenges. We have tzaddik v'ralo. You have a tzaddik, and yet God gives the short end of the stick. So the person says, something, not so simple. It's a challenge. That's the reason why a parent has an obligation to provide an education to his child, even as a minor, to give him an orientation of how to live as a Jew, what to believe as a Jew, to teach him certain verses, which every aspect of Jewish belief is rooted in those verses. The two verses you teach a child based on the Talmud, which the Rambam rules in the laws of Talmud Torah. The first verse is Torah Tzivavanu Moshe Moshe Kilas Yaakov. The Torah was commanded us by Moshe. It is the heritage of the congregation of Jacob. That's the first verse a parent teaches a child when the child begins speaking. Although the child has no understanding what those words mean. But there's a certain innate kedusha, holiness in those words, because that's a verse in the Torah. The second verse you teach a child is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. This is the fundamental of Jewish belief. Unity of God, Almighty, infinite. That's the second verse. Child doesn't even know what those words mean, but mouthing those words using the brain to be able to articulate those words. The brain has been touched by two verses which innately lying in those words encompass all existence. Who God is and what the Torah is. That the world life is only a blueprint. That's only, the Torah is the blueprint of existence. That's Torah Tzivon Moshe Kilas Yaakov. The Torah which was given to us by Moshe, that is the heritage of the Jewish people. Because that conforms, that addresses every aspect of our souls. Every level of development, every aspect of our potential is addressed through that Torah. We speak, people have different potentials. No two people have the exact same potential. But whatever that potential is, studying the Torah and actualizing it and understanding it addresses whatever that potential is, which will bring you to a level of understanding of how you're supposed to live your life and what kind of choices you have to make during that lifetime that you have, and how to utilize every moment of the life, which is an endowment of God to us. But the question is, where does it all begin? What about Tevlach Shem Elokeichem? I always said, and we discussed this in the past, God says at Sinai, when he gave us the Torah, you are now Goy Kadosh, you're a holy people. You're the Ama Nivchor, you're the chosen people. Chosen people. Moshe says, you're God's children. Every morning, a child gets up and his father is waiting for him to give him a spanking. What is this child supposed to think? I'm loved. I'm your child. I'm your chosen. I'm your holy people. We're the chosen people. No people in the history of this existence have suffered, have been persecuted, have been displaced. The Jewish people, we still suffer anti-Semitism. And now it's rearing its head at a very extreme level. It depends where you're located in the world. We're the chosen people. What's it all about? Again, this is all rooted in one's belief and understanding of what exactly the world's all about and what the atonement process is. As we said, one only stubs his finger on the terrestrial level if it was pronounced from above. And therefore you have no right to take revenge of that person who either hurt you, denied you a favor, because you were denied the favor because God didn't want you to have the favor. Why? It's a challenge. That's a choice. You say, I accept God's decision, that I'm not supposed to have it. I'm supposed to suffer that embarrassment, that pain, that trauma. So the ultimate challenge is we submit to God. We negate our own understanding to God. If you have humility, it's irrelevant. As I said just a week ago, a person goes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, why must we keep dietary laws? So the rabbi says to the person who poses the question, do you believe in God? He says, of course. Do you believe dietary laws are divine? Yes. So he says, so what difference does it make? But I'd like to understand. So the rabbi says to this person, I'm the rabbi, says to this person, I would like to discuss Einstein's theory of relativity. Could you explain it to me? He says, I'm no Einstein. If I'd have Einstein's intellect, and if they would accept me in MIT, maybe I would understand it. But unfortunately, I don't have that degree of intellect. So you say to the person, you mean Einstein's intellect you don't have. You don't have the capacity to be able to come upon its understanding. But to understand God's reason why he legislated dietary laws, because it has to do with the spiritual makeup of our souls, that you expect to understand. But I got to understand. You're talking like a fool. You can't up two numbers, and you want to go into a level of math and calculation, which there's no computer who can calculate that, to give you any inkling of what it's about. But it bothers you. Why don't I know? You know what it's about? It's all ego. It's ego. God, why did you cause me pain? But when he eats the non-kosher, he doesn't ask why he ate the non-kosher. And when he spoke non-truth, he didn't ask himself, why did I speak non-truth? Where I knew I wasn't supposed to speak. I knew I lied. And I knew I did something dishonest. That question didn't resonate at that moment because he crossed those lines. But why God reacts to his dishonesty, that bothers him. A person does a criminal act, and he comes before the judge. Judge says 5 years in prison. Does it enter his mind for a moment, why am I being incarcerated for stealing? And you already were warned 6 times. You're a repeated offender. And they told next time they're putting you in prison. Does he have a question why he's going to prison? Because this is the what you pay for that kind of crime. And especially when you're forewarned. Do you have a question? But yet, when I violate the Torah, when God says, if you violate it, you get lashes, you get the death penalty, spiritual excision. And there are other issues that go along with it. Suffering in life, disappointments. But God, why? He asks, why if I steal and you're caught? Or why if you kill? At one time you put to death, or now it's life imprisonment, or 25 years to life? Is there a why? There's no why. But yet with God, there's always a why. But that's always the challenge. But God is so merciful. Right away. So God's mercy creates the problem. God should be more merciful. Human beings, they don't have that capacity to have such mercy. But God, look at humanity, how they misbehave, and God tolerates them. Why is God picking on me? So I explained with an allegory. This family has 2 children. They have a child, barely average intelligence. Graduates high school. They get it. He needs a job. They go to the local pharmacy and they ask, could he hire the son? What will he do in the pharmacy besides drugs and other medical items? They sell ice cream and soda. Who work the soda counter? He'll pump soda. Sell eggnogs and egg creams. That'll be his thing. That's what he'll do. The next son has a superior intelligence. That he graduated high school at the age of 15. He was accepted into every university, scholarships, the best universities. The next son says to the father, you know something? Rather than going to university and committing myself to years of study, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get myself a 9-to-5 job. The rest of the day, I'm just going to whittle away my life. The father says, nothing doing. He says, what about Billy? That's what he does. He says, Billy doesn't have the capacity to do more than he does. You could turn the world over. If you take advantage of the opportunity that's at hand, you could become something one of a kind. So the son says, but I'm not interested. He said, you may not be interested, but of course, if you're my son, I will force you to appreciate it and take advantage of the opportunity. Otherwise, I will deny you every amenity of life that you only through pain will you realize that you have no choice but accept what I want you to do. And someday you're going to thank me for that. That's what the father says to the son. So the son says, I'm not doing it. Okay. First week, the parent says, you're moving out of the house. Well, I'll fend myself. He realizes he can't fend for himself. And then the few dollars he has in his pocket, after a short time, he no longer has it. He realizes he has no choice but to come back home, as they say, with the tail between his legs and say, yes, Dad, I will do what you want. Yes, Father. Just tell me, give me the script. I follow the script. That's it. That's Jewish history. God says, you people, I created this existence for you. My Torah is for you. It exactly conforms your souls to advance at a level that you're part of eternity. And it's an opportunity. There's no opportunity like this. Because only you people have a share in the world to come, could cleave to my being. Only you. We're not interested. God's children. If you don't understand and appreciate what that means, you would run to embrace it. But yet you don't. Sometimes you have to suffer pain to be able to come to certain realizations. That's Jewish history. Because we are the chosen people, and we have such capacity and such unlimited potential, God says, I'm not letting you get away with it. Whatever it takes for you to address your potential, it's going to happen. The Gemara tells us at the end of Sanhedrin, for Mashiach to come, which God's held not too far off, it has to be predicated on Jewish people repenting. They have to do tshuva. So Mashiach will come either if the generation's kuli zakai. They're all meritorious. You're meritorious, Mashiach comes. It's going to be a painless experience. Because the Jews, being meritorious, they have the right vision, the right perspective, but we know we're not perfect. So of course, we'll do the tweaking to bring us to that perfect level. What about, we say, we have no interest. We're not meritorious. The majority of people are unworthy. But God says, the moment that's come, he has to come Mashiach. So how does God work it out? So the Talmud tells us, even if God has to install a king whose decrees are more harsh than Haman or Russia, than Haman the evil, which there was a decree to annihilate every man, woman, and child, I will install that kind of king. And through pain, you're going to say yes. And through pain, you're going to do tshuva. You're going to repent. And then Mashiach comes. God says it's your choice. Either with goodness or with pain. But ultimately, it's happening. And that's the way it's going to be. It's only because only because we're God's children. We read in last week's reading, as a father disciplines a child, that's the way God disciplines us. Read a verse in last week's parsha. So Rechaim HaKodesh explains, you see somebody else's child misbehaving. You don't say a word. But yet, when your own child misbehaves, you discipline him. So the son says to the father, when you see the other person acting even worse than I'm acting, it may bother, but you don't do anything. You don't take action. Why, when I misbehave, why do you take action? That's the question the child asks the father. So the father says to the child, you know what the difference is? Because you're my child, he's not my child. Kasha yasa ishes beno. The way a father disciplines his child, identically, God disciplines you. Meaning, when a parent disciplines a child, is it to hurt the child? It's only to steer the child in the right direction to get him back on track. Identically, when God disciplines us, punishes us, it's not to destroy us. It's only to alert us, to bring us to a level of clarity that we've gone astray and we have to get back on the road. I explained it with an allegory. A person is running. You know, years ago, they used to show in a movie, I'm going back in the 50s, how did they actually, you had herds of buffalo in the United States roaming the prairie. When they would hear a clap of thunder, the buffalo started to run. And sometimes they would run. They didn't realize there was a cliff. They'd run off the cliff and they'd all fall to their death. That's what would happen. You know how many people are running? It's just a question of time before they go off the cliff, or they've gone off the cliff and they don't even realize they hit bottom and they're still moving. That's a reality. You see a good friend of yours jogging in a direction with his headphones on, preoccupied with his triple infusion of whatever it is, of music. And he's experiencing ecstasy. I'm not talking about the drug. I know what he's experiencing. And he's running in a direction, jogging, out of touch with reality. And his friend sees him going in that direction, that he doesn't realize within the next hour what's going to be, his life ends because he's going off a cliff. So what does the good friend do? The good friend picks up a pebble and he throws it, not to hit him, to hurt him. It whizzes by his ear. And if he'd be attentive, he would realize that something whizzed by his ear and he turned his head around. So he should be able to tell him he's going in a direction of danger. The man notices nothing. So what do? You take the pebble again, another pebble, throw it, and you hit the tip of his ear. And it's a twang. The person winces, and because the person's so distracted, it's not enough for him to be cognizant that somebody had thrown the pebble, which gave him that momentary pain. Okay, no problem. But his friend doesn't want him to actually do something which is going to end his life. What does he do? He takes a large stone and he throws it at his legs. Enough to knock him to the ground. Hits him right behind the knee. His knee buckles, he falls on his face. Why did he fall? He realized something hit him behind the knee. Again, picks himself up. He's back into his trot. He's trotting, jogging in that direction. The friend realizes it's not going to be good. He takes a heavy boulder and he throws it on his legs that he's pinned under the boulder. And he still doesn't get it. He's into his music. He's in his own world, and his head is bobbing up and down on the floor, and he's dragging the boulder on the back of his legs, and he's crawling towards the edge. You ever hear such a thing? And he's already halfway suspended over the edge. And the man, he's wearing the psychedelic glasses. He sees something else. He doesn't see the reality before his eyes. So what does God do? What does his friend do? He said, you know something? I haven't left a stone unturned to alert you, to awaken you, to realize where you're going. You know something? You're beyond help. It's hopeless. You're helpless. You want to take your life, go off the cliff. And it ends with that. There's no stone God leaves unturned. Pain. You have a fever, alerts it that there's a problem. If you don't address and you don't take advantage of the alert, it goes from bad to worse. And eventually it can turn into something which is not recoverable. You can't address it, or you have to take drastic measures, intervention to be able to address that, whatever it is. That's exactly what suffering is all about. Because if you understand what those words mean and the ramifications of those words, your life would be a different reality. Even when you have pain and when you're disappointed, there's no disappointment. I always say, what is the basis for disappointment? Expectation. You have expectations, you're disappointed. But if a person has true humility and he feels he's unworthy and whatever God gives him, he's thankful, there's no disappointment. That's what it's all about. So even when you get the pain, if you have the belief, you say thank you. As it says, as we give a blessing, we acknowledge God for the goodness in our lives. We say Shechianu. God forbid, when tragedy strikes, we say Dainu Emes. God is the true judge. It goes both ways, but it's one and the same. It's in the person's best interest. And as I said in the past, sometimes you're better off with the curveball than with the pot of gold. Because when you get the curveball, that's pain. Pain is atonement. When you get the pot of gold, the question is, what do you do with that pot of gold? Are you going to give it to charity? Are you going to become a Torah supporter? Are you going to retire and spend 12 hours a day studying Torah? Or are you going to Las Vegas or you do other things which are inappropriate, which are not in conformance with the Torah. That's the question. So sometimes you're better off having less than having more, because the less you have a road to hoe. Rowing that row that you're hoeing is not so simple. That's pain. That's deprivation, but that's atonement. And that's what it's about. So a Jew understanding his relation with God, that God is truly our Father, beyond the mortal Father. You don't lacerate yourself. You don't tear because you don't grieve to that degree. So now let's ask a question. But there is minimally a rabbinical obligation that when one loses a loved one does grieve. Once it's Shiva, right? That's mourning. There's a mourning period. Because factually speaking, if a person does you a favor, you have to acknowledge it and you have to reciprocate. It's called recognition of the good. It's called hakar satov, being appreciative. We have to show appreciation. That's what we have to show. We have to be appreciative. A parent who brings you into existence and especially raises you and provides for you, that all of the opportunities in your life and all your abilities due to your parents' investment in your life. Now that parent dies, don't you think minimally you should acknowledge that person's value in your life? So it's not you grieving for the person. Person's in a better place. It's not you grieving because that person's no longer there to provide for you. Because you're a self-provider. You're an adult. And you earn more than they ever earned in their lives. But what about that person's contribution to your life? That's called hakar satov. So that a person has to grieve and sit shiva and mourn the passing of a loved one, that's only an expression, acknowledgement that person made a difference in your life. That's what it's all about. Mar Shiva Zechariah Baruch once told me, he went to pay a Shiva call when Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, he's a Shiva Yeshiva University, his wife passed away. So he had a phone call. He paid a Shiva visit on the phone. And Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, Rabbi Soloveitchik said to him, he asked him the question. He said, it's interesting. If a person loses a wife, the mourning period is 30 days. The person said Shiva, 7 days, Shiva. After 30 days, the mourning period comes to an end. If a person loses a parent, the mourning period is 12 months. There's nobody closer to a husband than a wife, spouse. The Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, Ein Isha Mesa El Labailo. When a woman dies, the only one who she dies for is the husband. The husband's no longer the same person. The rest of the family go on with their lives. But when a wife dies, the wife is an integral part of the husband's emotion, mental makeup. And when that wife passes away, it leaves its indelible mark. So if that's the case, a person should grieve for a wife. The mourning period should be a year, no less than a parent. But yet, a wife is 30 days and a parent is 12 months. Why? That's the question Rabbi Soloveitchik posed to my Rosh Hashiva. So my Rosh Hashiva, the discussion was, there's a Jerusalem Talmud, known as the Yerushalmi, says that when you grieve for a parent, you're not grieving the longer period of time because the parent did more for you. A wife is closer than a parent. The Torah tells it's one of the 10 commandments. You have an obligation to honor your mother and your father. You have an obligation to revere your father and mother. Torah obligation. And the Torah says, and if you do, you're going to merit longevity, meaning in the world to come. It's a very special mitzvah. When a parent dies, God forbid, you know what you lost? It's not the parent. It's the context that you're able to fulfill the mitzvah of honoring a parent and mother. That's what you're grieving on. What did they represent? They represented such a stake in the world to come of opportunity that you had as long as they were alive. Once they're gone, you can't do it anymore. Therefore, the mourning period is a longer mourning period. It's 12 months. A wife There's no Torah obligation to honor a wife. Of course, there's a relationship. You have to treat a wife appropriately, whatever it is, respecting one another. But the positive commandment of honoring a parent, that only applies to parents, the ones who brought you into this existence. That's what you're mourning. So again, what are we talking about? We're talking about the spirituality, understanding what the value of is. In terms of physical, material support of God's children, he's a better provider than your mother and father could ever be. There's no nuance that he's not aware of. And he addresses it appropriately the way it's supposed to be addressed. Better than a parent. So why do we grieve the parent, mourn the parent? What's the opportunity, the context to fill that special positive commandment of honoring, revering is no longer there. There's a question which is asked by the Maharal of Prague. We find that there's a heavenly voice that comes out from Chorei, from Sinai every day, that announces to the world, Kola Olam Kula Nis B'Shvil Chanina B'nei. The world in its entirety is sustained in the merit of Rab Chanina Mendoza. Who is Rab Chanina Mendoza? Shadailo B'Kav Charubin Ner Shabbos Ner Shabbos. It was sufficient for him. He only had for sustenance, his material sustenance, a small measure of carob from Friday to Friday, from Erev Shabbos. That's what he lived on. And it was dailo. He had enough. In his merit, the whole world was sustained. So the millionaire could write that $1 million check. And everybody has an assortment of food on the tables with wines and liquor and whatever it may be. That's in the merit of Reb Chanina Mendoza, where he doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together. Shadailo b'kav charubin Erev Shabbos or Erev Shabbos. So the Maharal asks a question from a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. It says in Pirkei Avos that a person who studies Torah mitoch ha'tchak, if you study Torah within the context of below poverty subsistence, and despite the lack of material, you study Torah fully invested, the person ultimately will study Torah mitoch osher. You're going to study Torah in a state of wealth. Hashem will provide wealth because you've proven yourself. If in the state of deprivation, of the being deprived of material, you are no less committed, God says, now that you've proven yourself, now I'll provide wealth. There's no reason for me to put you in that vice any longer. So if that's the case, the Maharal of Prague asks, Reb Chanina Mendoza, nobody studied Torah in a greater state of deprivation than Reb Chanina Mendoza. And it says, till the day he died, he had nothing. He didn't have more than the Kav Charubin, more than the measure of carob from Friday to Friday. Based on the Mishnah Pirkei Avos, why did God provide him with this additional level of wealth? So that the Maharal of Prague says, you know what the answer is? He didn't want it. He didn't want it. He wasn't interested. You know, wealth is a very serious challenge. It's a serious challenge. What do I do with it? What happens if you don't invest it properly? If somehow it touches your ego and you become slightly less humble, I'm not doing pompous, less humble, you know something? It's not worth it. I prefer to pass on it. Thank you, no thank you. That was Reb Chanina Mendoza. Again, Reb Chanina Mendoza had a level of clarity, understanding what the challenges are. When you go through a minefield, even if you have a mine detector, if you're not cognizant every moment that mine detector, and you listen to every beep, and you're distracted, God forbid, you miss a beep, God forbid, you can step on a mine. That is the reality of life. That's how to navigate life is so complicated, it's not to be believed. I prefer it to be less complicated. The more you have, the more headache you have, the more distraction you have. I prefer it to be less distracted, have greater level of clarity, and as a result of that, my chance to succeed is far greater than having more. I prefer to have less.